Chapter 25. The Bell, the Button, and the Spy. General Hal picked up a drink from Matt's tray. Matt tried to still his shaking hands as the glasses on his tray began to rattle and clatter. He quickly moved on before General Hal could notice. Matt hadn't gotten far when another pair of officers stopped him for some punch. "I hear they hung a young man from Beer Lane for treason just yesterday," one remarked, taking a glass from Matt's tray and giving him a sideways look. "Arrested and executed without so much as a trial." "A filthy spy, no doubt," the other noted. "They deserve no better." Matt moved forward with his tray, studying each man he saw as he slowly circled the room. He could see it was going to be hard to spot the man in the red uniform with the scar and the missing button, since most of the men in the room wore the British uniforms of red wool. Time passed. More women in silks and satins glided by, as did more men in bright red uniforms. Suddenly, and without warning, Matt hiccuped loudly. His face grew hot with embarrassment, then dread, as he remembered Thomas saying, "Whatever you do, don't draw attention to yourself." Matt squeezed his eyes shut and held his breath to ward off the next hiccup that he felt coming on. And that's when he collided with a woman who was strolling toward him. 4 full glasses flew from his tray. Punch and shattered glass sprayed everywhere. The woman let out a shriek and slid on the slippery floor. She landed on her backside. "My stars, I think I shall faint," the woman cried out. "Catch that impudent rascal!" The crowd went deadly silent. Even the musicians stopped playing. Every eye in the room had turned to Matt and the woman. "My dear Mr. Streep, are you hurt?" an older officer exclaimed, rushing to the woman's rescue. He turned to Matt and picked him up by the collar. "What the deuce are you doing, boy?" he growled, giving Matt a rough shake. Matt was too startled to answer, but the shock rid him of his hiccups. Seconds later, the butler shoved him into the kitchen. "Now get a fresh tray, you clumsy oaf," the butler growled. The music started again, and the crowd's chatter and laughter resumed with it. A footman handed Matt another tray filled with glasses. "Here," he said, "take these, and have a care." Matt returned to the ballroom, anxious to find the man with the missing button. But as he looked across the room, his frustration grew. The room was awash with soldiers in red coats. "I'll have a glass of that punch," a low, whispery voice interrupted his thoughts. Matt turned to find himself face to face with yet another man wearing the scarlet jacket of a British officer. But he noted a purposeful glint in the man's eyes, as well as the long scar that ran down the upper edge of his cheek. "Clumsy of you back there," the man said, never taking his eyes off Matt. He reached for a glass of punch on Matt's tray. His hand lingered. Matt silently scanned the 4 rows of gold brocade that ran down the soldier's sleeve. He counted 3 buttons and saw the short strand of red thread where the 4th button should have been. He raised his eyes and met the man's gaze full on. That was him. Matt was sure of it. The scar, the missing button, and the look in the man's eye all told him he was the one. The guests were busy pairing off for the next waltz. Now was the time to act. "I see you are missing a button, sir." The words tumbled out of his mouth. Matt fought to keep his hand steady as he waited for the man to make his move. The man's steely blue eyes swept over the crowd. He picked up a drink and quickly drained his glass. "Yes, I am," the man answered, "and I would be glad for another." Matt's throat went dry, and his heart raced. He could barely remember what to do next. He fumbled in his pocket for the button. Where was it? He switched the tray to his other hand and reached into his other pocket. There it was. He grasped it securely and placed the button on the tray. "I say, this punch is quite good." The man's voice was calm and smooth as silk. He set his empty glass down, silently scooped up the button, and replaced it with another, all in one fluid movement. Then he stepped away from the tray. Matt stared down at the shiny brass disc. All he had to do now was to pick up the button and put it into his pocket. He was slowly moving his hand up to the tray when he felt a large hand on his shoulder. "I'll have one of those," a new voice ordered. Matt looked up. Another British officer reached for a glass on the tray. A panicky, gasping sound escaped Matt's throat as the soldier's white-gloved fingers grazed over the button. "What's this? Are they serving buttons with their brew?" the officer asked. Sweat gathered at the edges of Matt's wig. He looked around for the scar-faced man, hoping he would come to his rescue, but he had disappeared back into the crowd. Meanwhile, the officer had removed his white gloves. One look at his hand and Matt's blood ran cold, for there on the back of his right palm was a small dark mole, a mole in the perfect shape of a bell. Matt felt a sickly twist in his stomach as he recognized the surveyor from the coach, now dressed in a wig and a British officer's uniform. Thomas had been right after all. The man was no surveyor, but a soldier working as a spy for the Crown. And before Matt could stop him, the British spy scooped up the button from the tray, tucked it into his pocket, and smiled a snake-like smile. Chapter 26. After Midnight. All was lost in the blink of an eye. It happened so fast. It was exactly what Thomas had warned Matt not to do. He had let the button get into the wrong hands, into the hands of the Crown spy. "Did you see the rebel traitors on parade today?" Matt heard another officer ask the spy. "Yes, and a grim parade it was," the spy replied. "Grim it may be, but a necessary business," the soldier replied. "If you ask me, the Crown would do well to invest in more rope. String them all up, I say, and be done with them." Frantic with worry, Matt lowered his head, fearful that the spy might recognize him from the coach. Meanwhile, he had to get the button back. But how would he do that? When the spy turned on his heel and walked away with the button in his pocket, Matt summoned all his courage and followed him. "Excuse me, sir," he said. The spy swung back around and stared at him hard. "Do I know you, boy?" I don't think so," Matt sputtered, his cheeks burning. "But I think you might have mistaken my button for one of your own, sir," the scar-faced man said, coming up behind them. A tense moment followed as the two men's eyes locked, and they sized each other up. But the spy made no move to return the button. "Of course, my stop at the Lamb's Tavern before the ball and the 4 glasses of punch I've had here since have combined to render me unfit to be 100% certain," the scar-faced man said, suddenly slurring his speech. He weaved back and forth, leaning on the other man's arm. "Sorry, old chap. I seem to be falling apart." He lifted his sleeve with the missing button and waved it in the air. "Buttons falling off like musket balls on a battlefield, aye? Perhaps you know of a good seamstress, sir? One who's willing to sew on a button or two? And if she be comely, well, all the better." The other man's face relaxed. "You need to sober up, friend, or you'll be losing more than your buttons." He reached into his pocket and produced the large brass button, then handed it over to the scar-faced man. "Excellent advice, my dear fellow," the scar-faced man said, thrusting the button into his own pocket. "I shall retire to my rooms at once and put on a kettle of tea. Now there's a drink to curl a grandmother's hair, aye?" The two men laughed at the joke, but the British spy glanced back at Matt, and his gaze lingered, as if he was trying to recall the face before him. Matt bowed his head and pretended to check the glasses on his tray. It was then that he noticed the button. Somehow the scar-faced man had slipped it back onto his tray. Matt grabbed the button and quickly pressed it safely into the bottom of his pocket. He had it. He had the information that he'd promised Thomas he would bring him. Now all he had to do was get out of the lion's den alive. "Do you suppose we can convince the musicians to play one last minuet?" he overheard a woman ask. "Well, my dear, we can try, though it is nearly midnight," replied her dancing partner. Almost midnight? Was it possible? Had so much time gone by? Matt heard Thomas's warning in his head. "Whatever you do, you must get back here by midnight."